Thank you, everybody, for coming back, and thank you at home for joining us again as well. We have some heating issues in the room that we're in, so some of us are still wearing coats. I'd like to start again by welcoming you to a series of discussions today on the for NHS Lanarkshire on the Monklands Replacement Project. My name is Paul Parsons. I'm chairing the discussions today, and this afternoon we have our first session is a discussion on benefits criteria. So welcome to the panel. I'd like you to introduce yourselves, going around, starting with David, please.
My name is David Ross. I'm a director of KEPI. Our responsibility on the project is to articulate and illustrate the vision that underpins the Monklands Replacement Project.
Afternoon, I'm Isabel Brown. I'm an independent panel member. I'm looking principally at the economic development impact and skills and learning.
Good afternoon, my name is Douglas Bissett. I'm with the consultant WSP. I'm a technical director looking at traffic and transportation matters for each of the candidate sites.
Good afternoon, I'm Andy McCusker, also with WSP, technical director looking at ground engineering and land contamination on each of the sites.
Good afternoon, I'm Douglas Ross. I'm a director of Curry & Brown, and I'm looking after particularly the project management and the cost consultancy matters this afternoon.
So thank you very much. We have a discussion based on the feedback that we've had at the community events on suggestions for benefits criteria. So the criteria that the NHS Lanarkshire will use to measure the various sites and use that information to choose which is the most suitable site for the new hospital. So in the previous exercise, there were 4 criteria used. These were number 1, which was getting in and out of the site. Number 2, the description there is the extent to which the site location can be easily accessed by patients, staff and visitors by road. Journey times, the extent to which the site location is placed in relation to the catchment population for patients and staff. 3, public transport infrastructure, the extent to which the site location is supported by public transport. And 4, the ability to support centres of excellence, that is the specialised services based at one hospital site, and NHS regional services. So that's described as the extent to which the site can support centres of excellence identified in within NHS Lanarkshire Healthcare Strategy, achieving excellence, and the regional services. So I wonder whether, just as a starting point, it's not worth us having a quick discussion about what we understand by those 4. Are there any questions that we want to raise, or are they self-explanatory? Okay, so I will now move to the feedback provided at the events which have taken place over the past fortnight. So several points have been raised by people who've attended the community events, and they have also been given the previous criteria to comment on. I have themed the responses, and I've got the detail of that in front of me as well, which I can share with you. I have simply ordered them in relation to how many times they came up in the notes that were given to us. There were 4 community events: one at Gartley, one at Cosh, one at Coat Bridge, and one at Cumbernauld. The issue that was raised at all 4, the only issue that was raised at all 4, was economic benefit. The comments that were made were, in Gartley, there should be a positive impact on the wider community, not just patient population. Jobs and infrastructure improvements should be included. which site will demonstrate, you'll see the similarity in these comments, which site will demonstrate the widest possible impact on the community, and conversely, which will impact negatively. Further work should be done to develop impact measures which will demonstrate positive and negative impacts. Socio-economic benefits of the hospital to the local area should be included, the impact on the local community, and the impact on the local area employment opportunities, etc. So clearly a line of what is the economic benefit to an area of the hospital. And there are, I think it's worth us saying that the best practice approaches to criteria are that there will be some essential criteria which will already have been decided at this point. So is the hospital at this particular site a viable site? So is it big enough? All those different things that matter. If there is any contamination or whatever, can any remedial works be undertaken to make the site safe to build on? Then there are desirable criteria which help us rank the various sites which might be possible. And our rules for those are that firstly, you've got to be able to measure them. So you need to be able to get the information together to measure them. And they should cover all of the aspects that we're expecting to measure, so we should leave no gaps. And to avoid double counting, we should make sure that they don't overlap. So a positive aspect of one site shouldn't be double counted to give it extra weight. So, from an economic benefit perspective, Isabel, that's come up several times in our conversations on the submissions this morning. I wondered whether it's possible to give some general reflections on the usefulness of this, how it might be done, and whether information would be available. And I think we'll have that discussion around the table.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. I think that the public events have actually thrown up some very useful information there. When you're looking at any measures in terms of economic impact, there are a range of criteria that are, well established. So in terms of things like, the development of employment land, development of, what's the impact on jobs created, what's the impact on housing, there are, measures to use there. What is the impact on health and well-being? So not just about, the permanent jobs or the part-time jobs, but also about construction jobs that are created for, a period of time. And how do we, how does NHS Lancashire ensure that local people get the opportunity to take on some of these construction jobs that might actually just be, for a 2 or 3 year period while the, the build is going on. So these things are, will actually be teased out during the outline business case, and there are very well known measures there in terms of, how to go about that. I think that also things like the local business opportunities. So, from the current site where, where the hospital currently is, what's the detrimental impact on local businesses as a result of that move? And what does it look like then for when the new site is chosen? What is that multiplier in terms of, the corner shop, the petrol station, the people getting access as, for the local taxi companies, all of those things, and how do you actually, start to measure some of the opportunities there. But also further than that, when you start to look at the health and well-being, what needs to be, considered is about, the families, young people coming through, to ensure that there are opportunities there for them to understand potential careers and, within the hospital at all grades and all levels. So the impact on the schools, the impact on, driving qualifications up locally, so that basically there's a route for young people to see careers and opportunities.
thank you very much. I'm going to turn to other colleagues at the table, particularly in regard to the economic impact, jobs creation, and on all of those kind of things. Is there, I've seen lots of information in the business case around various aspects of this. Do we believe that the information exists to be able to look at economic impact as a feature of this particular scoring exercise?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think there's a number of established examples of major healthcare development, not dissimilar to this project over the last 10 years, and the impact that has had on, you know, the community at Dumfries with the new hostels there, or Forth Valley and Larbert. I think the point that I would have maybe wanted to make is that when you're looking at economic impact, and sometimes it looks like a black and white issue of you take a facility from one area and you improve the area locally around where that's going to the detriment of the one that's left. That's not always the case, and I think given that NHS Lanarkshire have a determination to try and provide a rebirth of the identity of community healthcare on the site at Monklands, there's an argument that regardless of which of the 3 sites this ultimately goes to, there's an added benefit from that point of view. I'd reinforce again Isabel's point about you know, the community benefits aspect of a major project like this is something that all of the consultants, all the contractors have to buy into now. You know, you have to engage locally with organisations that will ultimately benefit, not necessarily just for the construction period. You know, that's a really big thing in procurement now moving forward. If everyone involved in a project like this would try and engage with local education, because there's an opportunity to promote careers either in healthcare or in design or construction through a major project, it becomes a catalyst for a whole host of positivity, again regardless of which site it actually goes on. But I think the point here about economic development is it's not really an either or. One area isn't going to automatically be blighted because a facility's been taken and and relocated somewhere else. And I know it's persuasive to see that as being the obvious example. It's more about what that shift in identity becomes and how it serves its community going forward.
It's not an add-on. It's an intrinsic part of everything that actually gets done. Yes, absolutely.
I think the challenge will be to get those items that are measurable and different across each of the 3 sites. Because if you take the construction economic benefits, it will be generally the same across the 3 sites. Because it's a major investment no matter what site you go to, and each of the contract for the works will have set deliverable targets for community benefits no matter what site. So in a way that's not a differentiator, no. It's drilling down into what is the key differentiator for each site and how can you measure them.
So if the construction benefits are the same for each site, or roughly, I imagine and please feel free to correct, but I imagine that the economic benefits of a new hospital of roughly the same size are going to be the same or similar wherever they are. So the question to me then would come to what's the starting point of that area and what's the differential that it would make? Does that make sense at all?
Starting points are not always the same because in an area of deprivation, you've got low skills, low economic activity and attainment. So the thing about that is the starting point in one area might not be the same. So the step up could be much larger as a result of whatever that, But you are absolutely right in terms of construction, right? And in terms of the benefits will be the same across all sites. Right?
Okay. So I'm seeing that we can answer that yes, it's measurable, but that probably comes down to measuring the starting point rather than the impact, and because the economic benefits of building the hospital will already have been included in the in the paperwork. So I think it meets our criteria for a potential scoring criteria. Our question will be how, and we can possibly return to that later, but we've got quite a few to get through in the time, so if everybody's content to move on, that one passes the kind of first tranche of it's valid and it's possible. So the second, the one that was mentioned next most frequently, and I think it's worth noting that we've already gone from mentions, multiple mentions in each of the community events to 3 mentions in 2 events for this next one. So this is a significant step down if we can take the number of mentions as a measure of how important it was. But certainly the notes of the community events and the one I attended seemed to be it did seem to be an important factor for the members of the public who joined us. So number 2 is potential environmental impact. And here I've included, there is one feedback point which is in, here, which is also included elsewhere, and I'll explain how. So environmental impact was raised, potential environmental impact. Participants in Coatbridge said, raised the issue of local environmental impact in terms of potential flooding, impact on the rivers, and impact on local protected species. They said that should be taken into account as a criterion. People in Coatbridge also said that the impact on air quality should be included. There is nothing further here, but I imagine that's around extra traffic and other bits to do with hospitals. And in Cumbernauld, they said that basically a brownfield site is better than a greenfield site. So they said, what was the current use of the site and what's its history? Is it a brownfield site or a greenfield site? And then the note on it says brownfield is better than greenfield. Those of you more familiar with the assessments than I, what are the environmental impact assessments that we've done?
Yeah, so I sort of deal with those in 2 areas. I feel like if we set aside the brownfield, greenfield just for the moment, I think we touched on it in the previous answer. In terms of those wider environmental impacts, the key thing is to define your baseline for each of these sites in terms of what's the air quality at site A, site B, site C, what are the flooding issues at each of those, and then look at what the current development will do, and then a comparison is carried out. So it's a recognised process that will be done for each of the sites, and again it's back to defining the baseline to allow you to make the comparison. So you can't do it currently, obviously, but the information gets gathered to allow you to do that, and impacts on flora and fauna and air quality and everything else, as I say.
Okay, so what stage of the project will we normally expect that to happen?
I think once you get beyond probably the site selection process, you start to go into that in a lot more detail. We will be looking at that, and we have looked at it in for the site investigations, for example. You have to think, well, we could have an impact doing these site investigations, so ecologists have already been involved in the process to date, so there is some idea. It's a question of when you start to go into to look at these issues in more detail.
Okay, so there will be some information there already. The question
Absolutely.
is it sufficient for this part of
Yes.
for our purposes here?
Yeah.
Any other comments on environmental?
I think our view is that only one of the sites wouldn't necessarily require an environmental impact assessment as part of the planning application. Gartcosh, because there's a history of built work there already. The other 2 would definitely require that. It doesn't make the assessment of the considerations on design different. It's just a criteria in terms of the town planning process, I suppose. You know, all would require traffic impact assessment, but I think maybe the environmental assessment on Gartcosh wouldn't be as necessary for over the other two, where there's no history of development on the site.
Okay. I think it's worth noting at this point as well that there needs to be a manageable set of scoring criteria for the event that's happening next week. One of the things that we can expect to happen is that any suggestions that we make be considered.
Yeah.
And it may well be that these are important considerations, but they are important for another part of the process.
Yeah, and I think the second part of that that was mentioned is the brownfield versus greenfield, and we, as we stated earlier, we have got a lot of information and we are generating a lot of information that we can use to inform that process, and it is measurable, it does cover all the significant elements, and we can avoid overlap, so it is relatively straightforward in terms of defining that decision-making process.
Excellent, thank you. Any other comments on environmental?
Yeah, just to
sorry.
touch on there, in terms of we have done for each of the 3 sites preliminary ecological appraisals, and Andy said that was done particularly for the site investigation works, and Gartcosh, there was no real issues identified. We had to have special measures put in place for mute investigations prior to borals, but nothing was significant. The work at Glen Mavis was actually an area where land was sterilised because of nesting animals, so there was more of an impact probably there, particularly for the geotechnical work. And at Western Moffat there's some areas of impact around the periphery of the site but not within the main body of the site, so that sort of work has been done. Touch on the other bit about flooding, none of the sites are susceptible to flooding, so there's no real issue there. And the brownfield bit and greenfield you might know better in terms of planning rules, but I think there's a tendency to try and do brownfield rather than develop greenfield where you can.
But again, there's no, from a town planning point of view, there's no real differentiation between the sites from that perspective in terms of, you know, they're all major developments, and none of them are zoned for this type of development at the moment, so they would have to go through that process.
So David, returning, sorry Douglas, I'll get to you in a second. Going to the point that Neil Gray and Neil raised so helpfully earlier, around building and planning on the Gartcosh site, and other things have been turned down there. Is that something that we need to take into consideration? I think
the point that was made in the submission, the first submission earlier on there about applications, is an interesting one. It would maybe be useful if we could ask for a bit more information on that. You know, the specific case references on those planning applications, because I think they have to be material. You know, they could be relatively small scale. There could be other reasons for the refusal. I think for us to understand why they were refused, and if it was on transportation issues, then that would be important. We were, when we started the process, certainly unaware that there were likely to be issues from a planning point of view with a hospital development on Gartcosh or on any of the other 2 sites actually.
Okay, so we've been asked specifically to find out whether those initial discussions have taken place with the planning authorities.
No, not specifically with the team, and you wouldn't expect to engage with a planning department materially until you had a site to work on.
Okay, thank you. I'll pick that up with the planning team with the programme team in the next session. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think everybody's made some interesting points on the table, particularly in terms of environmental impact. As others have already suggested, you don't normally go into the level of detail of a full environmental impact assessment until you have a preferred site selected. It's quite a large and complex process, and it's highly unusual that you would do that for candidate sites at this stage. You would certainly do the desktop investigations and all the other work that you could do readily to inform the process, but you wouldn't necessarily get into the nuts and bolts of the site specifics until you got to a preferred site. In relation to brownfield is better than greenfield, I think that's generally accepted, that if were possible you would try and develop on a brownfield site and reuse that rather than take development on a greenfield site.
Thank you very much. So I think what I'm hearing is obviously an environmental impact assessment that meets the requirements of the law is a really costly and lengthy exercise, and that's something that would happen later when you're only doing it once for one potential site.
Part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So my question, I suppose, for environmental impact is based on the information that we have already. Here we've covered flooding, air quality, those kind of things, impact on local species. We've heard about investigations being done for newts. It sounds like we've got information that would allow us to measure it against each other. My question is it a useful measure, or are we going to get to something which is, it's about the same for each site? Do you think that if we use potential environmental impact at this stage as a measure, there would be something useful to come out of the would there be differential outcomes if we put each of the sites through those processes sufficiently to make a choice between them?
I'm not sure that you could be that specific at this point, and the only reason for highlighting the likelihood of an environmental impact assessment on a subsequent planning application perhaps being not required at Gartcosh is that you potentially have an environmental basis to start with there. It's whether you could get enough information to reasonably compare the other two sites that perhaps don't have that history of information in enough time for it to be a scoring aspect.
Okay, we'll ask that.
Brownfield versus greenfield in a way is taken account of in the costs and the financial appraisal, because the cost to develop the brownfield is potentially more than the greenfield. So when you factor that into the benefits scoring at the end, the financial, it all comes together.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think setting aside the brownfield, greenfield element, the other elements, they're not sufficient.
Yeah, I would concur with everybody here and suggest that there isn't a sufficient differentiator between the sites in terms of environmental matters that you could readily score at this stage that would provide any meaningful benefit to the scoring process.
Okay, thank you. So we will point those issues and the strengths and weaknesses of using that out to the programme team. The third point that was raised at Cumbernauld and at Coke Bridge. This was the issue of future-proofing and came simply down to, are the sites big enough to expand in the future?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yes, you can start with it.
I suppose from an architect's point of view, it might be worthwhile highlighting what a design team would look for in a site, that goes a wee bit more than just the physical dimensions of it. I think, for a new hospital, one of a size like this that's got a very specific clinical model that drives a lot of that clinical movement on the ground floor, then the dimensions of the site are undoubtedly important and the size of them important, but effectively it's more to do with a relatively flat, relatively characterless piece of land, a bit of a blank canvas, to be honest, that would broadly be square in order that the locations of all the different departments in that model of care are relatively close together. So 40 plus acre sites that are long and linear, let's say, aren't necessarily the best type of sites to look for, because at some point they will compromise the operation. So, you know, I think important maybe to highlight that what we're looking for is, you know, a lack of character, dare I say it, in the site, because essentially a hospital of this size is going to create its own concept, its own context over a period of time. It's going to create that character, and essentially you want to have as few constraints and features that prevent the development of that. So the ultimate extreme of that is you're working on an existing healthcare estate or an existing site. It's going to be constrained because you have to work around that. So that's the high level aspect of this. All three of these sites, to a certain extent, provide that opportunity for a blank canvas to develop a model of care, and all the infrastructure that goes with that, and crucially the adaptability of the design in the future to either grow or in some cases expand or in some cases contract. You know, that's what the modern healthcare facility is looking for. Of the three, only Western Moffat really gives a slight issue to that, in that there's a topographical shift in it that has to be overcome. It's an interesting architectural challenge, but you know, if you're looking at...
For those of us who don't speak architecture, what's a topical challenge?
There's not that many people do, I have to say, and less these days. The challenge is then maybe the overlapping of certain accommodations, so that it's not necessarily completely straightforward on the ground floor. I think also the site at Western Moffat would maybe force a slightly different approach to car parking, rather than free flat land expansion. It may have to think about stacking the stories of the car parking. But that apart, broadly speaking, the three sites are capable, to reassure the people who are asking the questions, the three sites are capable of taking the accommodation that's required, expanding that in the future in the areas that are likely to be expanded, and not providing any compromise on the design vision that we've tried to create.
Yeah, I don't think it's a differentiator, because it's part of the sort of design process that we've gone through today, developing the generic hospital. It has been looking at the departments that may expand in the future, which has helped test the land that would be required now and in the future, and all three sites meet that requirement. They have sufficient land to develop the current requirements and also deal with the potential future expansion that has been looked at in the departments that may need to grow in the future.
Thank you. So one of the questions... Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, Jay. Just on something there that David said about car parking, in terms of scoring for that, in terms of future-proofing for that. You know, what have we got in place that would ensure that the public comments about car parking are, you know what I mean, that they're being recognised?
Yeah. Well, there's again, it was mentioned earlier on this morning, car parking is a thorny issue. There's a whole load of factors that, you know, maybe colleagues are probably better to pick up on once I've finished. But the duality of that whole conversation really is, you know, hospital sites don't appear to have enough car parking at certain peak times. At the same time, you know, we're pushing green travel plans, and we're pushing a climate responsibility to how you travel to sites, and public transport's a key component to all of that. And then in the middle, the project will generate a regulatory response to the amount of car parking spaces that have to be provided. So I think, you know, you start with the regulatory requirements, you work out how that site's going to develop, and then you kind of address the other two issues as a bit of a balance, really, you know. And again, I kind of mentioned earlier on there that I think all three sites have got the capacity required to be able to deal with those issues as they move forward. You know.
So what I'm hearing is that future-proofing is built into the design process and into the site selection process already. One of the questions that we have is the attribute, so the future-proofing attribute, already covered in the process? And if it is, then we shouldn't allow it to go forward today. So I'm hearing that it's already covered in the process.
So yes.
Yeah, and are we content to give that advice to NHS Lanarkshire?
Yeah.
Okay. So we will explain how and why it's already covered, but it's our view that it is already covered, which allows us, thank you very much, to move on. And with this, we may have. This is another site issue that's come up. This one came up at Gartley and at Cumbernauld. The suitability of the site. Now, suitability is one of those words that gives us some cause to think when we see that on an analysis report, because it's obviously we were, in this particular case, we weren't given any measure of what suitability might be. So here in Gartley, we were told, or the participants shared, the health and safety of the site is a key issue in respect of land contamination, and this must form parts of the benefits criteria. We've discussed that this morning already, so that will be helpful as part of this consultation, this conversation. And in Cumbernauld, again, I've used the question here about whether it's a greenfield or a brownfield site. So I think we've heard relatively strongly today that the contamination on some of the sites is a concern for people. So that's probably where we could usefully start the conversation about measuring the suitability of the site. Anybody like to kick us off on that one?
Yeah.
Andy.
As you say, and we discussed earlier, it's quite rightly highlighted as being of potential concern, and therefore we are looking at it in the required level of detail. I think it does allow us to highlight some differentiating factors between each of the sites, and is, within the context of the stage we are in development, readily quantifiable. So it is something that, setting aside some of the complex issues that are associated with it, it's relatively straightforward for us to define each of those areas and to quantify those.
So it meets the initial criteria. Anybody, any other thoughts?
Do we have an ability to be able to present that for each of the three sites, from where they currently are, to get them all to the like a level where it's an equal playing field in terms of, well, this site will take X amount of decontamination and that site doesn't really need it, but that site might need you know, a huge infrastructure put in for whatever, so that everything would be at ground zero, and then you know where you are from a starting point before you actually get into the build.
Yes, from a financial point of view we have that information, because each of the three sites have their own site-specific costs that we've identified. So
that's helpful for the suitability then?
Yes, yeah. So that level playing field is there for each, from a financial point of view.
I think that was helpful from Neil and Alex's submission to identify that money's the common factor in those two. Is that sufficient? I mean, it's a measure that everyone can understand, but is it a sufficient measure?
It's one measure. The other measure is in terms of the treatment of the contamination. You know, at gap cost, there is known issues. There's potentially asbestos areas. There's potentially some heavy oil contamination, which can be treated. It's known. Other sites have different challenges at Glen Mavis that will need to be addressed, and potentially not as known because they're unique to that site. So there are different measures between each of the sites that could be looked at from a technical.
And just in terms of, and speaking as somebody who's run scoring events, they have to be comparable, and that, looking at the information that I saw, that would be I think that would be a challenge for lay people in the room to get their heads around, to be able to contribute to the scoring effectively.
I think the comparison areas are normally cost and programme. Is there a time impact on is time and cost really? And again, I appreciate the difficulty that you know, and until you really start to go into the site and investigate it in real detail, then to a certain extent these are by necessity relatively broad brush approaches, you know. But maybe the time
aspect is possibly a good one in terms of suitability of the sites. And,
yeah.
you know, there is different timescales of when the sites will be finished because of the constraints of actually developing the sites, not necessarily related to contamination, but just the sort of highlighted earlier in the response to the fourth point was actually the programme of actually getting a road there to develop the sites, because the East Area Link Road won't be there. So that's a suitability of the site, and in a way it won't be available to the same timescale. So there's different timescales for each of the sites.
Any other reflections?
Well, yeah, I think, and it may have driven the comment on brownfield versus greenfield, that to a certain extent a hospital development, which is largely structures and car parks and hard standings, is a good candidate for a brownfield site, because a lot of those structures, if you've got asbestos contamination at 2 metres deep in soil, but a hospital gets constructed on top of it, for example, that material won't see the light of day again if it's all been, so the development itself facilitates remediation. So whereas if it's contamination that might be compressible or gives you geotechnical problems at the same time as having contamination, then you would have to physically remove it. And probably also, without trying to go into too much detail, that just because you have contamination at a site, it's got to be able to get to the receptor, so that the whole assessment is built around a source, a pathway and a receptor model. So it's not just that, oh, you have contamination, therefore you have a problem. You have to assess that whole model, and then and critically assess it in the context of the future development, i.e. the hospital. So if you put a hospital on this site and you've got X number of patients, how do the site conditions potentially impact that, and how do you facilitate the development to make sure that doesn't happen?
Okay. Any other?
Can I just go back slightly to what you said there about the impact on timescales for the different sites? Is that, if that was of significant difference, would that affect how things were scored?
It should.
Yeah. So that potentially then would have an impact on the whole chosen site.
Bit of chair's privilege, I suppose, extra information. The audience in or the participants in the conversation at the event that I was party to felt incredibly strongly about it. That's where one of the comments comes from. And I can see how it would be measured elsewhere, but I think we don't do justice to the contributions that have been made unless we actually draw that out separately, so that we can see that it's been dealt with. So it is obviously a matter that is of concern for significant elements of the people who are using the hospital, or who will. We've had one contributor this morning call all this fake news, but that's not helpful the other way either. Actually, if there are concerns out there, then they need to be talked about and highlighted and taken into account in the general.
Yeah, when I raised the point about time scale, actually, it was not time scale in the wider scheme of programme. It was more the time scale and cost of alleviation or remediation for that issue, if you know what I mean. You know, the wider programme and time issues are, as Douglas highlights, are wrapped up in a whole load of other things, to be honest, about when a new hospital might be available for patients. I was actually thinking about if it's a differentiating factor that there's an element of remediation required on a site, and there's a cost associated with that site, then that cost is an estimated measurable thing. But the timescale for alleviation might also be an estimated measurable thing, whether that's a period of months or, you know, if another site, for example, doesn't have a cost associated with remediation, then the likelihood is it doesn't have a programme implication for that either. I think when you're dealing with relatively intangible things, latching on to the tangible bits are the only things that you can really measure, and it usually comes down to time and money, to be honest. So that may be a mechanism to be able to score an element of contamination on the basis of a desktop study for all three.
We have to be careful, so I absolutely accept that. I'm trying to deal with several different things that we need to take into account to be able to I think I'm not hearing anything that says we shouldn't say that this needs to be front and centre in our
I think it's
in the
important,
work.
yeah. It's significant to a lot of people, I think.
Which is good. The question then is how. If it's to do with money and time that we're measuring it, separating those out from the other things that we'll be scoring about deliverable dates and whatever entirely would be a challenge, because they're an intrinsic part of the costs and the time. So we need to make sure, and I think it might be a challenge that we have to either return to, given the amount of time that we have, that we either return to, or that we set out the considerations and ask the project team to make a response to that.
Part of that could be obviously the time and the money is in the financial appraisal, but there is the aspect that came up in the discussion paper 4 about the risks of working in the existing hospital. So if there is a benefit of getting out of the existing hospital quicker from a differentiating factor between the sites, that might be what you use to score.
And that certainly came up in the staff association submission. So I think the question is the technical one of how do we make sure that this is openly taken into consideration, but doesn't give the opportunity for double counting in the other criteria that are being scored. And that's going to take some time with a calculator and some pieces of paper. But if you're content, then I'll make that suggestion to the programme team. And thank you very much for your contribution on that. We move then on to the 5th one. We're running a little behind time. We move then on to the 5th one, which is about cross-border activity. We had one issue raised at Gartley and 2 at Coatbridge. The issue at Gartley was raised as the impact on other patient catchments should be included. Will the site draw patients from outside existing catchment, putting pressure on resources for local people? Coatbridge, impact on people outside the area and cross-boundary flow, which I read as very similar. And then Coatbridge, again, it's impact on local community, and you'll notice that I included that one in the economic impact as well, because I couldn't be sure which it meant. So just as background from my reading of the documentation, the patient catchment areas have been drawn slightly differently for the different sites. So Gartcosh is slightly different to the other two. That's correct, isn't it?
It has more of a cross-border flow,
element. And we already heard from the programme team this morning that doesn't impact on the financial sustainability, because the money follows the patient. So when the patient turns up, then the trust gets paid.
And also in the financial model for the capital cost, that has been reflected in it. The Gartcosh has one ward larger than Glen Mavis and Western Moffat, so the financial impact has been captured.
Okay. So what are the other aspects of cross-border activity that we might measure? Are there any?
People from outside of the area gaining jobs, employment. Would that be seen as? So
if Gartcosh was easier to get to, or one of the sites was easier to get to, so that would come down to the economic impact.
Yes, I think that would be covered there.
So we've already covered that, but we need to make sure that is part of it. So, the question obviously remains on how we communicate that that's been taken into account. But it seems to me that it is covered elsewhere.
I think so.
Yeah, did everybody agree?
so.
Yes.
Okay. Public transport and road transport are the next two. They were raised at Cumbernauld, the only place to raise public transport significantly in this particular section of the meetings. And Coatbridge raised road transport principally because of the impact on the infrastructure locally. It also mentioned air quality, and I included that earlier. There was lots of general concern in the meetings about travel times, number of buses needed to change, whatever, and train times. And I'd like, for this particular point, to raise, and it's a shame that he's had to go, but the point that Sir Harry raised earlier on, that there are essentially two elements to the transport issue. And the first is the recruitment and retention of staff and making sure that they can get to jobs. We have seen two different submissions today, one for, it's a bit blunt, but one for senior staff, particularly medical grades, and the other for other staff and the lower grades. The lower grades clearly coming from very near the hospital, with lots under 3 miles at the moment. And then, so that's the staffing issues and the two sides of the staffing issues, and the other stuff that we heard, which was about patients' travel. And obviously there's a different footprint for where the patients come from, the patients that are being served. And I think it's probably useful to have that, the totality of that in our heads. We have, and I'll remind you, in the first instance we had two criteria that were specifically focused on transport. One was journey times, and the other was public transport. As far as I can see, we have two issues that have been put to us today by the people who submitted and by Sir Harry's contributions that give us possibly another way of looking at that, and it would be useful to explore that here. Any comments on what I've just said? Sorry, a bit of a monologue there for a second from the chair, not always good.
I think in relation to journey times is a very difficult subject and very personal to the person that's affected, depending on the location of a potential hospital. Journey times also vary by time of day and day of week, and time of year as well. So when you look at the journey time from point A to point B, it depends when you measure that as to what it actually is. So I think the key here is maybe not necessarily to focus on what is that journey time, it is what is the difference in journey time, measuring it the same way for each of the candidate sites. So as long as you do a comparison between the candidate sites on a consistent basis, then you will get the differentiator in journey times between these sites, rather than being focused or hung up on what that number actually is, because inevitably everybody will have a different view on what that number actually is. And there's no right and wrong answer here. It is what is the differentiator between these journey times is probably the most important factor to take into account.
Thank you. Anybody else?
No, that's,
Punch
I think that's
You
Absolutely.
in a way that says, is there an industry an excellence that says, you know, X percentage of the patients should have no more than a 45-minute journey, a 20-minute journey? Is there a best practice excellence model that would help measure the 3 sites?
Not that I'm aware of.
Right.
I think that's because there's a slight evolution, dare I say it, of what a modern acute hospital is intended to do. You know, I think the only one I'm aware of is the general driver of a central hospital serving a population of about 250,000 people. You know, so in a country the size of Scotland, you know, you're looking at regional centres that develop healthcare at an acute level, but that strategy is about supporting that with primary care that's much more local. So I think the issue of travel time to acute centres is changing, and it's maybe why there's not such established baselines now, because I think the whole strategy has been reconsidered from a technological development perspective. You know, hospitals just simply do different things and will do different things in the future. And I totally endorse and agree with what Sir Harry mentioned earlier on about you know, social inequality provision not necessarily being measured by the proximity or development to an acute hospital. That does a different thing. That's essentially the cure. I mean, the prevention's a different matter altogether.
I think what was interesting, that's not where the cure lies long term,
Yeah.
but he did say that people from areas of multiple deprivation are more likely to be admitted to the acute hospital.
Yes, based on evidence and facts right now, you know, but you know, you're developing a healthcare system for the future, and they have to work hand in hand. You know, there has to be a primary care, localised community provision to affect those numbers that are going in that direction. Otherwise, why would you do it? You know.
Absolutely.
But I do think that there is measurable statistics. You know, they just have to be, as Douglas has mentioned, they just have to be based on the same journey, being taken at the same time from the same point to 3 different destinations.
Any comments from this side of the table?
No, I think I agree with Douglas's point. We do have the data to be able to measure the differences in particularly road transport across the 3 sites, so that can be used. And in terms of public transport, we have the data for each of the 3 sites to say which have better links to public transport. Because each of the 3 sites, you know, buses build it and they will come in a way. You know, the buses will come to the front door no matter what site, and the rail is different for each of the 3 sites, so there are differentiating factors there that can be used to score.
In terms of public transport, as just been pointed out, there's effectively 2 different forms of public transport. There is bus and there's rail. You can't really influence rail travel. There's either a station there or there's not.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to try and build a new station, you're going to be here for a long time. Buses you can influence. They can be run on a commercial basis, or they can be pump primed and forward funded to get them financially viable. What has been stated for all 3 sites is that they would all have a comparable public transport service to that's currently available at Monklands. So in other words, if there was a bus, and this is just an example, if there was a bus every 10 minutes at the moment to Monklands that served a catchment area, you would have to provide that similar level of service no matter which site you went to. Now, they might have a differing cost depending on where you go because of their locational characteristics, but the outcome would be the same. You would have the same level of service irrespective of which site you went to. So there's not necessarily a differentiator there other than potentially a cost implication. But again, at this stage of the project, it's very difficult to accurately pin down the cost because your population is ever evolving and changing, whereas your hospital location's only fixed in 3 places effectively.
Okay. I think this pulls up a number of considerations that we need to give the programme team some advice on. We've got the elements to be able to measure these. The question is what's useful and how, and what meets, what addresses the issues that have been raised for us. There is commonality in the two of the submissions that have been put to us, but from a patient and a staff perspective. So at the moment, lots of the lower grade staff are coming from the same communities that are worst affected by health inequalities and the deprivation factors. They are the people who are least likely to have cars to be able to travel. We have talked about, and I suppose this is one big cake of data, and we need to decide how to or come up with suggestions about how to cut it up. So, as far as I can see it, there needs to be some more detail than general travel times by bus and car and by rail to help us understand those things. So it needs to be a range of times, because bus transport is all very well until you try to get home after 8 or 9 o'clock at night. I think we need to understand, and this is from experience with various different projects, that actually travel times tend to impact the visitors, especially with unplanned acute admissions, which are going to affect the people in poor areas more. They tend to affect visitors more than they affect patients, because they're making more of those trips. So if you're looking at the two things, you've got a different footprint as well for staff overall than for patients. So we would need to factor in those kind of things. So rather than just give the programme team a load of different criteria that we want to see in the measurements, there are already two here. Essentially all of them are in some way about transport, the previous criteria. Does anybody have any reflections on how they would go about starting to unpick that so that it can be themed into measurable criteria that can be used to score these options against each other?
I think from the visitor's point of view, you have visiting times that are essentially, what might be classed as peak transportation times, and that whilst the journey time, let's say, on different modes of transport might be different across the year, if you're at least focusing on visitation times in the day, then I think that does give you a tangible measurement between each of the three sites from an accepted starting point. I think stuff is maybe a wee bit more complicated because people are coming from different areas, and how you differentiate the split of what public transport and private transport is for that becomes a wee bit more complicated. And I think patients are, that's maybe a slightly different consideration again. Certainly an outpatients facility is day round, until the session ends. But I kind of genuinely think that it's the only measurable, comparable statistics are from a starting point to 3 different sites at different times of the year, but at the same time at different times of the year, if that makes sense. And then working your way through these 3 different criteria in order that you can, unemotionally present the facts of what that represents from each of the 3 sites. I think it would be difficult to do more than that and drive down into that in any more detail, really. It's probably the one area that I thought actually you can have legitimate statistics that are directly measurable, in terms of how long it takes you to get from one bit to another from a similar starting point.
And we've got lots of data around that already, haven't we?
We do, and as just been highlighted, It's very difficult to try and present the information in an easily digestible format. If you look at, as I said before, about consistency and using a sort of the same basis for presenting the information, if you start introducing different criteria, so you might look at travel times in the peak periods, in the morning periods going to work, in the evening period going home from work, undoubtedly when traffic is busier, it will take longer, irrespective of which mode of travel you use. The question would be, is that a relevant piece of information to provide? Potentially not, because congestion is going to be over a wide area, and so you would be affected very similarly, irrespective of which site you went to. So there might not be a differentiator there that would be relevant to this scoring session. The data that's been presented so far has been presented in a sort of off-peak period where we're outside the traditional morning and evening peak periods of congestion. So it gives you a more consistent factor rather than a variable journey time. You get a fairly consistent journey time. And that gives you an easier to understand data set to do comparisons between the sites. And as I've said before, it's not necessarily the overall journey time, it's the difference in journey time that's probably more relevant to most people if you're trying to differentiate between the sites. So the information that's there already is probably the most relevant information to try and score in this future sessions.
So let me just pick that up, if I may. The thing, if I'm a member of staff currently at Monklands Hospital and I live just down the road, and I can walk if I want to, then it's not a mid-afternoon travel time that matters to me or gives the process credibility. And I think that's one of the things that we need to take into account here is if I put myself in the shoes of the people that I met in Gartley, then I'd want to be assured that when I need to get to work, that time has been considered. Does that sound reasonable?
It does sound reasonable, but my understanding of current hospital shift patterns is that there's many shift patterns, not just 3 or 4 or 10 or 20. There could be hundreds of shift patterns. So I think to try and present that data in a manageable format that people could digest is an impossible task.
Isabel?
I think we have to find a way through it, right? Because unless we satisfy the public that basically we have considered, we will always have objections here. So are we not able to say, right, okay, if you're travelling to get to one of the new sites at 9 in the morning, so you're travelling at 8 a.m, right? Or if you're travelling at 11 a.m, or if you're travelling at 4 in the afternoon, or 8 o'clock at night, there must be something there that you can come up with a norm in terms of 3 times a day or 4 times a day. Do you know what I mean? Which covers the majority of patterns, right? That says, okay, if you're travelling from Caldercrooks to the current site, it's this amount of time. And I have read some of this in some of the reports. But if you're travelling from Caldercrooks to the current location, it's that amount of time. But if you actually are travelling from Caldercrooks out to the 3 sites at 8 in the morning, at 11 in the morning, it's 4 in the afternoon, and at 8 at night, what does that look like, and what is the impact on people who either are driving or people who are relying on public transport, given the fact that there will be new public transport put in place at some point in all of the sites, right?
That's a very interesting point, actually, and a very good suggestion as well. I think for travel times by car, it's certainly doable to look at 4 or 5 times a day. So looking at the morning peak and off-peak period, an afternoon and an evening, and you could readily do that. Where it would become more difficult is with public transport and buses. As we've already discussed today, there's probably less public transport availability later at night and very early in the morning, everywhere, not just at one particular site or another. So on the existing conditions, that would be a very difficult exercise to do. All you could do is say that, as I said before, is provide a similar level of service consistently across all 3 sites in terms of public transport. In other words, they would all be accessible to the same degree, irrespective of which time of day you went to visit the hospital.
So that's a commitment, not a measure.
Yes.
I'm keen, though, because of what we've heard today, to make sure that the disadvantaged communities, those that live with the greatest deprivation, are highlighted in this process. They're much more likely to need to use public transport. The car ownership stats aren't brilliant in certain of the areas around here. I know that when you need to go to hospital, people chip in and offer lifts and all of those other things. But I think we need in some way to be able to show those communities, and I mean the area around Airdrie, but there are also other areas that various of the contributors have identified, to say that actually, and again, we're talking about if somebody from those areas is more likely to have an unplanned acute admission, then the people that live in those areas are more likely to be visitors to the hospital. They are less likely to own a car. So actually, to highlight in that process, even if we can't do it very first thing in the morning, if we're saying in this that actually we need to take visitor times into account, because if you've got an unplanned acute admission, you don't go to hospital on the bus.
No.
Actually, are there a couple of times of the day where we can look at the transport? So is that afternoon visiting and early evening visiting, that where we can give that information to our scoring panel next week, that maybe isn't universal across the whole patch, but does look at those people who we believe are most likely to use public transport. So those areas that are relatively easily identified. Have we got microphones? Yeah. Those areas that are relatively easily identified on the index of multiple deprivation, single out.
And not the straight points. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not the points that are already on just the train lines or the. How do you get from where we are?
That estate to the bus station.
Right, which is almost like cross district.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'd be content in if I was looking at this from a best practice approach, I'd be content to make some assumptions about the last leg of the journey to the new site, because of what we said about the buses, build it and the bus services. You can't measure a bus service which doesn't yet exist. That's clear. But if you were using as a proxy, I know the proximity doesn't particularly work for Monklands currently, but from the station to the hospital, or an average of the 3 in the area, or whatever it is, to use that proxy to say what's the difference for the last leg, then it's going to be common to them all. So that would be useful. Does that sound impossible to anybody? Or?
Sounds a challenge.
Okay.
Leave that to the experts. You're dealing with sort of hypotheticals in a way.
There are a huge amount of unknowns in this what we've just been discussing. I think we'd certainly have to look in further detail. I think there is additional information that can be provided. How detailed that is, I'm not entirely sure at the moment, given the many unknowns that are prevalent here.
I think of all the scoring that will go on, the travel and journey times will be the absolute critical factor in a lot of the decision making.
so let's go back through. That's a wide-ranging conversation. Let's go back through where we might go to wrap this up. So we're agreed that transport isn't sufficiently covered as it stands, is that right? And we're going to look at other ways to do it. So we are going to, it's there in the criteria anyway, so this is a suggestion about how to cover it possibly differently. Do we have the data to be able to measure it? We're sure we've got quite a lot, or we might be able to get some of the others. It covers all the hospitals, all the potential sites, so that works. The data is measurable, and is it possible to collect or gather data that might make it possible to measure? So I think the answer to all of them is yes. There's a feasibility issue, and you will have to, or the program team will have to have a view on whether it's the assumptions are valid and all of those other things. But I think if we're content to strongly encourage the program team to take into account those disadvantaged communities specifically, so that the scoring panel has some information that it can use, then that would be would that be something that you're willing to support around the table? I think it's possible. The question is, what assumptions is the program team, the decision makers, what are they prepared to take on board? Even if, in terms of public transport, it's a couple of proxies and there are these indeterminate factors, these which remain open. But getting to the closest station or something like that at the moment would be the way forward. Okay. So thank you very much. Does anybody have anything else to add to the criteria? Do we think we've covered everything that's been submitted today and before?
I think so.
I've got one more. The last thing to came up in Cope Bridge, and it was that the views of local people should be taken into account. Now, again, just from experience, that's a challenge because the views of local people change depending on which local people you're talking to, and I'm encouraged to hear that the program team is undertaking. This came up once. There is a general feeling that local views should be taken into account, but this came up once in the written notes. The program team is undertaking some polling activity, some research activity, so that it's better informed on those things, and I think perhaps that is that's covered by that rather than us suggesting. There are ways in which to measure the views of local people, but they tend to come down to referenda and various other things. So a structured sample of research will give them a fair view of what's happening. So is there anything else that we would need to add onto these discussions? Are we content with the suggestions we're going to make to the programme board? Well, thank you very much. It's been a really interesting conversation. I'm really pleased that the programme will be able to show that the information and the comments that people gave us at the community events over the last couple of weeks have been considered, analysed and then taken forward. And I think it's now for the programme team to say, we've handed that over, so it's now for them to say what they've done with it. Okay, so thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you very much to everybody who's been watching us at home. The questions that you've been submitting, I will ask. We're running a little bit behind time, but I will ask of the programme team if you will join us again at 3:25, so in a quarter of an hour's time. Thank you very much.